Hey friends, we're back with another short version of The Professor and the Pastor. This is Bob, he's the professor. I'm Jeff, I'm a pastor. And we thought we would do what we're calling mini sessions, a couple of these in the month of October. And since October, for a lot of people, is officially what people call spooky season because of Halloween coming up, there's a couple questions that we thought we would tackle that maybe will be helpful to you or interesting at least. So in the last couple of weeks, I have gotten asked by a couple people the question about what many have referred to as soul sleep in the history of the church or Christianity, which is the question about what happens between like the end of time or the resurrection from the dead and the time that I physically die on this earth. So where does my body go? Where do I go after physical death before whatever the end of things is? So how would you answer that?
Right. That's part of a much larger question. What is the afterlife like? And Christians have been divided on this. There are some groups, sometimes fringe groups, that will believe in what they call soul sleep, which says that when I die, I just kind of go into a state where I'm more or less in suspense. There certainly is some thought to that. There, in the parables of Jesus, there are some things that might imply that there's this intermediate state. But I don't think that's really the case. For me, as I read the New Testament, there is this idea that there is something that takes place for me and that I am somehow conscious after I die, but before the resurrection. The resurrection is more of some kind of physical thing that takes place. So there's a series of texts that we could look at to kind of get an idea, and you more or less have to pull those texts together to make this, to really kind of understand what's happening.
And that's kind of the point of this conversation. There really isn't a direct teaching on this because it's really not that important of a thing.
Right.
So that's kind of a principle of Bible reading. If there isn't a direct kind of language for it, there's a good chance that it's kind of a secondary issue that's not on the forefront of importance for us. Doesn't mean it's not interesting or that we don't want to think about it, but that's kind of part of, I think, what we'll get to at the end of this answer.
Yeah, and I think the main thing that we really need to establish is, for Christians, there is something that takes place after death, whether it's a sleep and then a resurrection, or some kind of event or something that makes us conscious of being alive or being in existence after death.
And historically, the church has always pointed to the idea of bodily resurrection as sort of the end point, or at least the end point of sort of this era of our existence. And then from there, after that day of the Lord, the resurrection of the dead, then begins the sort of kingdom of God that Jesus talked about so much. And what we're talking about, soul sleep, is a different idea than what our Roman Catholic friends would call purgatory. That's a whole nother subject.
Right.
But this is kind of a different question. I got asked this question because we were doing a class and we were talking about the story of Cain and Abel from the Old Testament. And, Cain kills Abel and God says his blood cries out to me from the ground. And one of the people in my class said, well, what happened to Abel after he died before the resurrection? And that kind of brought this whole question up. So there's a number of key texts that you kind of pointed us through in these notes.
Yeah, and just to go back to what I said at the beginning, this is part of a broader discussion of what happens to everybody when they die. There are Christians who believe that eternal life is derived from the life of Christ, and that people go into non-existence, or what we call an annihilationist. Certainly, if you're not a Christian, you may believe that you just cease to exist, which would be very, very similar to that.
The common thread through Christian history, though, is that all Christians believe that there is some sort of judgment happening after we die.
I think there's three things that you need to look at. One is there life after physical death that exists until the resurrection? How does the resurrection occur, or when does the resurrection occur? And then what do we mean when we talk about the judgment? And those three things are all kind of interrelated. And
you can disagree somewhat on those three things and still be within historic Orthodox Christianity. That's another good thing to think about if you're wondering this question, or maybe you turned this video on and now you're wondering the question you weren't before. It's just to know that there is a variety of ideas even within what we would consider Orthodox Christianity or historic Christianity, that all would still fall under that umbrella of being accepted as part of the faith.
Right, right. Often we perceive the afterlife as either you're in or you're out, but you still go on.
Right.
Some of that comes from Dante, actually. Dante is one of my favorite authors.
Some syncretism even in our own faith.
Sure.
So you pointed to us to a few stories. Yeah. So there's the story of the rich man and Lazarus in Luke 16, which is a pretty interesting story.
Yeah, that particular story, when you go to Luke 16, it's verses 19 to 31. In that particular story, Lazarus is a poor man, a beggar who's at the gates of the rich man, and he's starving to death. The rich man has all this wealth and doesn't really do anything for Lazarus. They both die, and they go to a place which is, for Lazarus, is a place of comfort, which is called Abraham's bosom. He's participating with Abraham in the covenant, even after death. The rich man goes to another place, which is a place of torment, and they can see each other, but nothing can really, they can't really interact with each other. So the rich man says to Abraham, let Lazarus come and give me something to drink. And he says there's no way for him to get there. So there's a separation.
There's a great chasm fixed between them. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a separation of the people who are righteous and the unrighteous. That's an important parable, but it is a parable. So there may be some level of symbolism in there, but I think the message is that there is a reward and there is something that occurs for the righteous where we go to be with the other righteous, which Abraham, of course, is the father of the covenant.
The other part of that parable that's really important is when Lazarus says, well, can you send someone to tell my family?
Yeah, and the rich man does.
The rich man does. And Abraham says, well, they had the prophets, God has already been telling them, and they're not listening, they're not going to listen to it. So I think that's more the point of that parable is more about righteous and unrighteous and the chasm between. And it's not about where this place is.
Yeah, and the message actually is that even if somebody was resurrected from the dead, if they don't believe Moses, they won't believe the person that's resurrected, which may point to, of course, to Jesus himself, the fact that he's resurrected, and yet there are those who don't believe. So that's the rich man and Lazarus. So the message in that particular parable seems to be that, at least when Jesus tells it, and some people will divide this between what happens after Jesus' resurrection and what happens before, there is a place where there is some kind of consciousness that occurred. And if you ever look at that famous Eastern Orthodox icon where Jesus at the resurrection is breaking open the doors of hell, he's releasing Abraham and those who are being in a state of waiting. So that may be the case. It may be that this is simply symbolic of saying, yeah, there's something more. It's that simple.
Yeah. Yeah, and we covered that icon in our atonement conversation. We actually showed that image. That was pretty cool. So the next one you put in our notes here is the story of the Sadducees, who Luke points out don't believe in the resurrection, which is really important.
Right.
They come to Jesus with basically a trick question. They're like, hey, this guy has a wife. The wife dies. She marries one of his brothers, because that's a whole Levitical thing that was actually a pretty good thing in their time to take care of that woman. That's a whole other subject. But so this happens 6 or 7 times. The husband dies, she marries a brother, and they say to Jesus, now in the resurrection, which they don't believe in, whose husband is she? Or who's her husband?
And of course, Jesus' response is that in the resurrection, there is no marrying or giving in marriage, but we're like the angels. Now, that may mean that we're in total communion with God, but his point is followed, that particular point is followed by the fact that he says concerning the resurrection, there is, concerning the resurrection, the Bible says, or the scriptures teach that God is the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and he says God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. So, and he's saying this in the present tense, so in some sense, you get the sense that these people are still around doing something. So that's, and of course, if you ever dive into Eastern Orthodoxy a little bit, they have some very interesting ideas. One is that after we die, our work doesn't end. It continues on. And it may be on a different level, and it may be slightly different, but there is some kind of conscious state. And Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are all around somewhere.
And that they're in some state of waiting for the bodily resurrection. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And so then we have Paul's words in Philippians, his famous line of "To live is Christ, to die is gain."
Right.
Sort of centered in that is
Yeah, and that's a pretty straightforward one. That's probably the most direct statement that we have about
departing
and being somehow in existence with Christ. And for Paul, of course, he's in prison. He's wrestling with maybe an impending martyrdom. He doesn't know what's going to happen, and yet he says, I know it would be better to be here with you, but, and I'm saying it backwards, but to depart and be with Christ is certainly...
He's saying, if I could choose,
that's what I would choose.
Yeah.
So Paul is actually saying that somehow there is this existence that takes place after I die. I'll be with Christ. And that mirrors our current status that's given to us in Ephesians, where we are elevated to the throne of God and we exist in some sense spiritually with Christ. So we're enthroned with Christ even as we speak. But Paul's being a little bit more direct because he is speaking of physical death at this point in Philippians.
Of course, then we also have the famous resurrection chapter, which is 1 Corinthians 15, which is all about the resurrection. Paul saying basically, if the resurrection isn't true, this whole thing crumbles to the ground.
It's a waste.
Yeah.
Right.
And we should be pitied.
There is one other text that you might want to consider, and that's Revelation 6:9. Now, the problem with the resurrection text, it's not a problem, but you have to understand that the resurrection texts are all very symbolic. So you have the souls of the martyrs under the altar crying out to God, basically saying, when are we going to receive justice? When is this going to occur? And they're told to wait a while. So in some sense, there's this consciousness depicted there. And again, I want to state that Revelation, with all of its symbolism, is sometimes hard to understand and hard to...
Well, we don't read a lot of ancient Near East apocalyptic literature.
No, we don't. And yet,
for us.
For many people, Paul and the whole idea of the New Testament is a very apocalyptic picture. Something has occurred that's been revealed, and now we have to, we live within that state. But it is another witness to this. But those souls are seen as in a state of waiting. So let's progress to the resurrection. You mentioned 1 Corinthians 15.
Yeah.
That whole chapter is a very important chapter in terms of understanding what Paul believes about the resurrection, because he goes into great detail. And he says, if the dead are not raised, then we're of all men most miserable.
Yeah.
Because it's such an important doctrine, it's such an important belief, because we believe Jesus was resurrected. It's that simple. And Paul goes in it and he says, I'm going to give you what was passed down to me. So this is not just Paul speaking. This is Paul speaking for the church and for...
This is an apostolic word to us from Paul, Yeah,
and it's been passed down. And part of it is the fact that even in baptism, we symbolically die and are resurrected.
We covered that in our baptism conversation where we even say that when we baptize someone. When they go under the water, we say, you've been crucified with Christ and raised to newness of life.
Now, Christians are going to probably disagree with the precise sequence of how things occur at the end of time, but generally, the resurrection and the judgment occur concurrently, and at some end point in time. Some may place millennial ideas place this period of time between the two. For me, I just like to see it as one type of situation, one event that occurs.
It's a climactic ending of history. Sort of.
And C.S. Lewis kind of held to that. And if you ever read his book, The Last Battle, it's a beautiful picture of how there's a separation of people in the resurrection as they enter into Aslan's kingdom. But that's C.S. Lewis, not the Bible. So anyways, there's a series of texts here that we can actually look at to try to understand what's going on here. And Jesus talks about the parable of the wheat and the tares. And he says at the end of time, in the judgment, the angels will come and they'll harvest. And at that point in time, people are separated between who receives life and who receives death. So the tares are burned up. The wheat itself is gathered into the barns and becomes, just that's a picture of the resurrection and the entry into our reward.
And that whole parable is actually not even about that particular. It's about not being able to tell who's really a believer and who's not, and leave that to the harvesters, which is not you. Your job is to go scatter the seed And yeah, the enemy comes in. If you know the parable, the enemy comes in at night and sows the seeds of the tares, which are like weeds. And the servants of the master who owns the field say, should we go pull them up? And he says, no, just let them grow together. And at the end, the harvesters will know what to do. And so the point
Right.
that is being made is it's not for us to judge who's in and who's out. It's just for us to scatter seed and love people well and let the harvesters worry about that which is not us.
Right, right. I mean, there are people who will tell you, people who claim to be Christians, who will tell you that other Christians, other believers, are not in the covenant. For us, believers, we there's some minor issues that we're going to disagree with. We don't have to be very specific about them. There are people that are not Christians, though, and that's God's judgment comes to all of us, not just to Christians. The other text is Matthew 25, the famous parable of the sheep and the goats, where people come or the nations are gathered. That's an important point.
Yes.
It's the nations that are gathered, and God judges them and says, when I was thirsty, you gave me to drink. When I was in prison, you visited me. When I was sick, you came to me. So there's a sense that these people had done the right thing. We certainly can apply this to our lives, but
Right.
primarily this is about the judgment of the nations, that God does look at the bigger picture sometimes and say, this nation has done wrong, this nation has done right. I mean, you can think about some of the great...
Well, we could think about the war going on in Ukraine right
Sure.
now. I mean, that's
Sure.
an example.
Yeah, a totally pointless war that is just killing people and on both sides. But the point is that God does separate people between the righteous and the unrighteous. And realistically, when you think about this, and think about what's being said, particularly with the idea of judgment, we're always judged on what we do. It is not that we're saved by works, but it is that when we are saved, we enter into a covenant with God, we enter into His people, and there's work to do. There are things that we are told
It's this
we
participation
are to do.
idea.
That's the whole participation in Christ. And if we're not doing that, well, there's real question is, do you really believe?
Right.
That's really the question. Faith always leads to labor, to the work of God. So that's Matthew 25. It's one of the more common ones that's raised up. Again, if we read what Paul says in Romans 2, he talks about the judgment of the church and the fact that there are people who are levying judgment. This goes back to your point that we're not supposed to be levying heavy judgments against each other, but there's judgment going on, and it tells us that God judges even the secret things, which could be our motivations. But again, it says God judges equitably. If you do well, if you seek to do the good, then you're rewarded. If not, then
Right.
God's wrath falls
God is a
upon you.
judge that judges not based on what He sees, but righteously, which is
Right.
Which is why the creed is so beautiful when it says that we believe that He's coming back to judge the living and the dead.
Right.
And I think when I think about this pastorally, if somebody were to ask me this question, there's sort of two ways that they could ask it. Number one could just be a Christian who's just kind of interested in some biblical facts that are kind of intriguing, and then if that's the case, I'd probably dive down the rabbit hole of what is soul sleep and the history of it and and that's all interesting. But there's another way that someone can ask this question where they're really asking, what's going to happen to me? And they're wondering, and I think the answer to that question, and I think you would agree with this, is not to get lost in the technicalities of where do you go and is it Hades or it's to ask the question, well, where are you with Jesus?
Yeah.
Are you participating with Christ? Have you trusted in Him? Are you following Him? And if that's the case, then that question becomes a lot less stressful for you.
Yeah, I think so. It's again, I want to go back to the fact that we're saved by grace, not by works. But works are a natural consequence of what's involved with faith. We aren't just escaping something. We're entering into something, and that something is the participation within the Church of Christ and within the work of Christ. So we're always saved to something. Just keep that in mind.
I heard a preacher once say it this way, where heaven is not a place for people who are afraid or escaping hell as much as it is a place for people who want to be with Jesus and God and the Holy Spirit. And
Right.
I think that's great. Now, the technicality of what heaven is and how that works and when do we get there, all interesting questions. But the real question, if Jesus were here and we asked him this question, he would probably answer with some kind of parable that throws it back on us to say, where are you in relationship with Jesus? And so if you're watching, we would just encourage you to really dive into that question for yourself. And you know, ask the question, what's my relationship with Jesus? And if you can't answer that question with, man, my relationship with Jesus is based on my trust in him, then we would just implore you the same way the Bible implores you, trust him today. Because then you'll know the answer to this question, and you won't be so worried about what's going to happen. Well, thanks for watching, and if you have questions, you can leave them either in the comments of wherever this video is, or you can send them to the email that's listed in the description of the video. We would love to interact with you. That email will come to me, and I'll forward it to Bob, and we'll interact with you over that. So, again, thanks for watching, and we hope to see you on the next video.